This episode was recorded before the SAG-AFTRA strike.
Ready graphics? Ready theme?
Good evening. For your information tonight.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mullins.
And I'm Lauren Milberger.
And this is FYI,
the Murphy Brown Podcast.
And someone's playing like bad smooth jazz, and I miss that bad smooth jazz. I'm like, boop, 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 boop. And then it's a scene, I'm like, man, that is my essence right there.
And on today's episode,
we'll be talking about Season 3, Episode 2, Brown and Blue.
Hello.
Well, hello there.
Hello there. Welcome to, as they might have called, a very special episode of Murphy Brown.
I was about to say a very special episode. We are of the generation.
Yes, but also very special because we have a guest. Will the mystery guest please sign in?
Oh, hey, everybody. My name is Tarik Davis, or Tarik Rashawn Davis, my full name. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. We've been talking for a while about, we love to have a guest, but this episode in particular, we wanted to have a guest. And a guest with your particular expertise.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know what expertise I have, but I'm happy to provide whatever expertise I can. It was a very interesting episode to watch.
Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Yeah, certainly. I'm an actor, improviser. I don't use the term comedian often because I don't do stand up, but
sure.
I guess it could fit. I've studied and performed at Upright Citizens Brigade, at Second City, Boom Chicago in Amsterdam, for Freestyle Love Supreme on Broadway. I met Amber of the Amber Ruffin show in Amsterdam. That's how we became friends. I've been in the comedy scene for a long time. I know a lot of stand-ups and a lot of friends, and I started in the late 90s. So that was a different time, and the standards of comedy and what was acceptable, and especially during, doing comedy, which was considered quote unquote underground. It was, I say it was a different time. However, people have been here, like Black people didn't just exist. Women didn't just exist. The LGBT community, we've been around, and we've been objecting to things that were objectionable, and I certainly have and was and faced consequences of that. So seeing this episode, it was interesting in that regard.
I appreciate you saying that. Something that I find interesting that I would love to talk to you about as we go through this is the idea of the consequences being on those who take issue versus the consequences on those who are causing the issue.
Oh, yes.
Oh, look at that interesting book you have there.
Are indeed real. I'm holding up for your listeners. I'm holding up my copy of the book "Burn It Down" by Maureen Ryan, and I highly recommend it. Although I will say, at least for myself and my therapist, she was like, "Yeah, there's a lot of triggers in there for you, so just be careful."
Ooh, yeah.
And if you have if you are in the entertainment industry, and if you have had to weather any kind of trauma, whether it be physical, mental, any kind of abuse, this is there's a lot of trigger warnings in this book. That's a fun note to start this podcast on. I'm usually a much more fun guest.
We love a
sorry
fun
guys,
note.
I don't.
That's a great book. I'm on the wait list at the library for that.
Yeah.
I'll be reading it in 3 months, maybe.
I haven't seen an episode of Murphy Brown in a long time, and there was something first. It was mad comforting just to slip back into like the very early 90s television, and like I'm like, oh man, this is so sitcom-y, and it's
this one in particular is
unabashedly it's great.
The bumpers in between scenes of just like where they have B-roll and someone's playing like bad smooth jazz, and I miss that bad smooth jazz of like boop 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 boop, and then it's a scene. I'm like, man, that is my essence right there. Anyway, but the thing that I noticed immediately, as soon as like the scene started, they made like an early. Yeah, they made a reference to a bunch of stuff from the early '60s, and I was born in the late '70s, and so that the references they were making were before my time. They were my parents' time, so they were jokes that my parents would get. But I, being like either forced to watch a show because that's what they were watching, was like either like, all right, what does that mean? Or I would investigate myself. But there is no indication at all in that entire episode of like, let me explain this to this 12-year-old child, this joke about the Beatles or about laughing. Here comes the judge, right? Like, it's just the context of these people of that time. They're all grown. They are all grown as hell, making grown jokes for their grown people, and you get it or you don't. And I kind of miss that. I'm like, oh, I don't. This is something specific about this very broad sitcom, but it's very specific that I don't feel like we do anymore.
Oh, I think something that Murphy Brown does particularly well with that is that those references will also be character specific. So Jim, as the oldest one, makes the oldest references, like you're acknowledging. And then Corky's going to make a different reference that's for the younger crowd at the time. And Miles, he'll have no idea what's going on because he's 27. And I think that's something they're really smart about. They're intentionally referential, even within character.
And I think it's a really interesting thing to bring up, because I would say that there's a lot of things that at first I got in the context of jokes, right? Like, I didn't know about Watergate. I knew about the jokes about Watergate. Right. I knew that Nixon recorded himself because of the jokes. Like when I was 14, I was making shredder jokes about Nixon. I might not have understood what they were, but I got it in the context, right? And I think that that's something also that doesn't happen as much, is that the assumption is that people aren't going to get it in the context, or at least find out about it, right? There's also a great thing that is sort of a little bit like this, that the writers of Cheers said about writing comedy, which I really loved, which is that they would have, sort of the highfalutin, Frasier-like jokes on the show, and then they would have sort of the lowball jokes. So if they were going to have sort of a highfalutin, Frasier-like joke, they would follow it with a lowball joke. So the people that were laughing at the high joke were still laughing, and the people who didn't get the joke then got a joke that was for them, and then they were laughing, and now everyone's laughing, and no one pays attention that they didn't get it.
And the best is when Kelsey Grammer as Frasier would like turn into like laugh at a Sam Malone, and like he would break down like, actually, but like those moments are like, it's like, oh right, this is why everybody chills at this spot. And yeah, it was, for as broad as it was still very specific and very intelligent, very smart. And now I'm like, I don't want to cast aspersions on sitcoms today, but I do know that personally, if I had a preference, like, I'd much rather sit down with an episode of Murphy Brown than I would like Big Bang Theory, or just because I don't feel like, those characters are as specific as Miles, who's like, what's the so you got Michael Chiklis coming in as the Andrew Dice Clay, and Miles is like, I'm about that ratings. Also, this guy's very anti-Semitic, like that's he brings it up.
Man,
he's like, it's an issue for me, but I'm a journalist. And it's like it's a quick moment. If you don't catch it, it's gone. But
well, I think it's interesting what you say about that they're very intelligent. They're very intelligent, and they don't assume their viewers are stupid. I think your viewers are smart enough, one, to figure out a reference if they don't get it, to use context clues and understand it's a joke if they don't get, to know that if Jim is saying this and it's probably a certain type of comedy that Jim would have found funny, and so therefore that's the joke. Even smart enough to connect that about Miles, that he is a baby version of all of the other producers out there who have told him to just look past it, because he's supposed to make ratings. He's supposed to make money. And so he's already, as a baby producer, like, this is offensive to me, but I'm letting it through.
I think it also brings up that idea that is brought out now, which is getting a lot of backlash, as it should. It's like, we need to represent both sides. We need to be a fair journalist, which I think is a little bit Murphy sort of, has an issue with at the end with
Murphy
herself, right? But sometimes no.
Yeah.
Right? It's not the other side. It's the wrong side. And maybe we don't give them attention.
Yeah. Who has the is it I'm gonna butcher his name. Eli. I can't remember his last name. A famous author. He survived the Holocaust.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wiesel?
No. Is it Eli Wiesel?
No?
Yeah.
But he talked about. He said I think it's him that I'm attributing the quote. I could be wrong, but about that you can't tolerate the intolerable. Any any healthy democratic society can't tolerate the intolerable, and it's interesting. Like this Dice Clay character played beautifully by the commish himself,
Thank you for bringing up
The
that.
commish.
Michael Chiklis of the Shield and the Thing from Fantastic Four. Just like I like to call, I think of Michael Chiklis as like Bruce Willis's like stocky
Yes.
younger brother. Like just
Yes.
like there's like a series of bald actors, like bald East Coast Jersey tough working class, like Lego build kind of guys. Like
He is Lego build. It's
he's
absolutely
Lego
true.
build, and I love him for it.
Like you can even see in this character what Lego hairpiece he would have been given, which just popped right on.
It's definitely the Bruce Willis hair. I mean,
Yep.
He's got.
I think that's
They were receding around the same time. I
Yeah.
think they were related, but yeah, like he does a really good job. And this was, I think, I don't know, was this? It came out in 1990, so the commish was the 80s. So is this after the commish?
It was before it.
This is
the
before.
commish?
So this is a very interesting time in his life because it's before the commish, but it's after he did Wired. So he has just played John Belushi,
Oh, right.
but the movie gets such backlash and controversy from the family, from everyone who knew him, and so it's his first big, huge thing. You know, he came from the theater. He didn't have that many credits, and it's just toast in the media.
Was this before or after his appearance on Seinfeld?
Oh,
Because
that's a
he
good
plays
question.
a-
I feel like it's before.
He plays
Yeah.
a similar character on Seinfeld, where Jerry and Kramer like they get like stranded in like the boonies, and he's like he owns the house, and he's like hey, you can crash here, but like I'm gonna come to New York and y'all show me around as like a favor, and then like he just gets drunk and he's an offensive like New York tourist. And
Yes, I think this was before.
this is before.
I really think it's before because when I looked up his IMDb, I remember being surprised how few credits he had before this.
It's interesting that he
Particularly
did
before. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, it's interesting he did the Belushi and then this and then also Seinfeld because that's such a specific casting trope to be stuck in, and then to see him do the commish and Shield and the Thing. Like I have such a strong, as a geek girl who goes to all the conventions, I have such a Thing memory of him.
Yeah.
Like I remember watching the commish and Shield and all those things, but he is the Thing to me. I have yet to have a Thing that matches him.
He was a great thing. He was a great Ben Grimm. Yeah, Michael Chiklis is a hell of an actor.
Yeah.
Like, let me just say that. But you could see like he's not winking.
No,
As
he's not.
big as this character is, like he is in it. He is in that character, and then when he switches for the interview, and it's like, ooh, this dude.
You know how
is the
smart
devil.
he is.
Yeah. It's
Like Carl is not wrong. He is the devil himself. Like he is so intelligent and knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
So I looked it up. So the Seinfeld episode is in 91.
Ah.
So after this, he does like two things I've never heard of, and then LA Law, where he plays a character named Jimmy Hoffs. Oh, come on.
Jimmy Hoffs?
Jimmy Hoffs. Who do we get to play Jimmy
Gee,
Hoffs?
I wonder who that could be.
Oh, what about the Lego dude? Oh, we got to bring in the Lego guy to play Jimmy Hoffs.
I wonder who he could possibly be pretending to be. No one will get
Yeah.
it.
Gosh.
Jimmy Hoffs. Yeah, it's an interesting episode. I have a lot of thoughts about Clay and like this depiction of Clay. And I
Yeah,
was a journalism major, so I'm also like
Oh,
the
awesome.
journalistic
Ooh.
the aspect of objectivity
Impartiality.
and
Yeah.
impartiality and
Ooh, well,
journalistic integrity. It's like, I got a lot of thoughts on
I'm
this.
sorry, sir. You said what expertise are you bringing?
Yeah.
We're hitting
Right.
every note here right now.
Right.
Well, why don't we get into the summary
Shall we?
then? Yes, shall we? The drudge of it. And so you may not realize this, but when we start this sort of mall, we've been here before. in an episode where it was FYI for kids. So now we're with a bunch of people who don't know what the First Amendment is. Now, I'm curious what both of you think. Do you think that this is something that would happen today, considering how the First Amendment is so
Jimmy
in the
Kimmel.
news? I mean, yeah, this is definitely like a Jimmy Kimmel thing. But like, do you think that this many
think it's what
people
happened.
wouldn't know what the First Amendment was as don't know in this opening?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's scary to me.
I feel like Jordan Klepper just had a spot on this, you know?
Oh, you're right. I think
I feel like that.
What am I saying? Of course.
You know?
Of course. Luckily, at the end of it, there are a few people who know what the First Amendment is.
Now, I do think that perhaps the change to today is as opposed to all the people in this clip being like, no, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like people would be very strong and wrong with their answers. Like, I feel like you'd find people who would very, very passionately and emphatically give the wrong answer.
Yeah, I could
because everyone doesn't want to look stupid now.
I could see someone being like, being asked like, "Oh, would you vote for Trump?" Of course, he defends my First Amendment rights. What's the First Amendment? Say what? Like, know, like in that same thought, like,
yep.
I mean, well, we don't teach civics in the United States.
Yes, we've talked about this a lot on the show, and it was something that I had not realized to the extent to which civics had been pulled from the curriculum until we started talking about it on the show.
Yeah, no, we don't teach civics because civics requires context. Context gets into history. Like there's a great thread. I don't know if you follow Michael Harriot.
I don't.
I know of, but I don't follow.
Former writer of The Root, was a writer for Amber Ruffin show. He's like one of the most brilliant minds on social media. If you don't know,
I'll definitely check it out.
Follow Michael Harriot. But he posted a thread this morning or last night, responding to Nikki Haley, who like.
I saw that thread, but I mean, Nikki Haley I saw, unfortunately, but interesting.
Former governor of South Carolina, she had posted something about how former President Barack Obama was like kind of a bad role model for anyone who's immigrated to the United States, right? And so Michael Harriot just unpacks the history of Nikki Haley by starting with the Civil Rights Movement and how the Civil Rights Movement made it possible because before that there were, especially in South Carolina, only a few countries were allowed to immigrate, and they were mostly like of the white European variety, and other countries were not. And it wasn't until after the Civil Rights Movement that was made possible by the black labor of the civil rights leaders of that moment, right? And in South Carolina, like there were these schools. You've heard of the Daughters of the Confederacy, that were set up that taught an alternative aspect of history. But Nikki Haley's family, they came in, and her father specifically taught at HBU, while she went to one of these segregated schools and changed her name, which was not Nikki Haley, to Nikki, and learned was indoctrinated to all of this kind of, very limited, dare I say, false kind of history.
You can say false, yeah.
Yeah, false history that, is basically what Ron DeSantis and all of these managers are trying to institute over all public schools today. And that's what she learned, even though the reason she was able to immigrate to the United States anyway, and her father taught at a historically black, college, she still comes out, changes her name. You don't know her ethnicity unless you actually do that research that we were talking about. And then if you do, hey, guess what? You run into all this context and all these, and like, that is a civics class. Like, Nikki Haley is a civics class, but there are people in power who don't want that, and I dare I say, not even her, want that history, unfolded out for students, because it's just like...
Oh, it's just that the idea of the people pushing against critical race theory are the ones who don't want their kids to see grandma in the history book throwing stones at a little black girl trying to go to school. It's we're too close now. No one wants to see the accurate history in which people that we now recognize are the assailants.
I bring that story up in relation to the Murphy Brown. Was like, that was my, as a journalist major, who was not a journalist, let me be clear. I majored and then was like, I'm gonna do comedy. But the thing that I would have loved to seen if episode was like a two-parter was Murphy Brown's a journalist. She doesn't ask this comedian who he is, what his relation. She finds out.
Yeah.
And that's what we find out in that interview. Like, I love her editorializing, but I'm like, yo, read this dude for filth of like, you've had 3 divorces. Your mother is a nun at so-and-so. Like, who is this guy? Like,
go interview his mom.
Yeah, exactly. Like, then you get to find out, like, oh, by reading him from filth and reading his factual history, we get to understand why this person is putting on this role, why this person is doing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Play a clip from his first stand-up, because I bet, like, if you watch a clip from Dice Clay's first stand-up, he's not Dice Clay.
No,
That's
he's
not
not.
his real
It's what
name,
started working.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was my only thing. I'm like, yo, you're a journalist. Be a journalist.
Yeah, I
This
do
is
think
the
that's
moment.
interesting because we have seen her succeed at that in other episodes up to this point. We've seen her be able to use her journalism skills to decimate somebody. And so it is interesting that this is the episode, this is the person I know in the section we're about to get to, we talk about the King of Shock. We've met the King of Trash TV in Jerry Gold. Like, we've met people who are misogynists and difficult and try to talk down to her and all of these things. And he's the one who's undone her to the point that her journalism skills flee.
Right.
So I also want more of that.
And the first part of the episode is, it's quirky. She's on the phone with her partner,
Husband.
her husband.
They just got married, so they're newlyweds.
Right.
So they're sort of in
That's
the first blush of love. That's sort of what the joke is, you know.
Oh, indeed.
Yes.
But my man is listening to the phone call.
I know. Like,
And I'm
what?
like, this is an episode about misogyny? And I'm like, my man is just like,
This office is full of capital N nice guys.
screw.
And you watch them. You watch Frank do
Yeah.
it. You watch Carl do it. These men who are like, I'm nice.
Yeah, he literally does when he confronts Michael Chiklis's character, and because Michael Chiklis is hitting on this woman who literally just like, all right, we're gonna have
Existed.
you walk across.
Walks in and then stands. I know. It's so like,
Yeah.
and then
You
I
gotta
walk,
The Duchess.
and then I pause, and then
Yeah.
I go. Yeah.
I was like, oh, this
Yeah.
is beautiful.
This is still happening.
And then he starts hitting on her grossly, and then I forget the character's name.
Frank.
Murphy Brown's best friend, Frank. He's like, I object, and I stand for women's rights. And the woman's like, oh my goodness, and he's like, yeah. And then like does the
Yay.
grossest arm around her shoulder, and I'm like,
Frank.
come on, y'all.
And
like,
the whole audience just like laughs so hard at this. Like, he's using it to hit on her.
they erupt.
Yeah.
They
Oh, yeah.
erupt and cheer, and it's just like, that's the misogyny we like.
Because he's so nice.
We talk a lot on the show about, retrospect and like looking at things now that like make you go, oh, or make you cringe or something. And it's funny because having now seen, at least 2 seasons now, we're into the third season in order. You see a lot of that kind of, fall away with Frank. And I don't know if it's because the times changed or they realize, but I think also as an actor, Joe, just like you can't get away with it because he comes across as a nice guy.
Right.
But the being on the phone thing is, even though I think it plays like I'm your like little brother kind of a thing, it's so highly inappropriate.
It's still a
Highly
grown man doing
inappropriate.
that.
Yeah, and you can tell the actor is like, I always think of that. Every time I see that actor, I think of him in Street Hawk, but that's me.
I was hoping you would bring that up.
Yeah.
But,
Oh, Joe, I love him so much.
yeah, he's, great. He was like, one of those great lovable character actors, but you could tell he's even like, he sells the joke, but it's just like, that's not him.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's not him.
We talk about that with Eldon the painter. When we first meet
Right.
him, he's disgusting when we first
That
meet him.
shocked
Right.
us.
But but the actor is so lovable and so soft that eventually it evolved with him as well, but it's why we don't hate him. It's why he's not a complete creep.
And my thing is like, all right, so this is, I was doing like, I watched Murphy Brown when it was on, but I was a
Yeah.
kid, and like it
Mhm.
was fleeting. Like it wasn't. It was like a show that I knew my parents would watch. I know they had like very special episodes that like because it was a show that people talked about. So I knew it was
Mhm.
on and I would watch it, but I don't have too many memories. So I had to like do my research, and I was like, "Oh right, Murphy Brown had a past as an alcoholic, a
Yeah.
recovering alcoholic.
That's the pilot. Yeah, she comes back from Betty
Mhm.
Ford.
Yeah, she's a baby boomer, child of
Mm-hmm.
the '60s, right?
Yeah.
So she's around my parents'
Yeah.
age, and my thing is like, okay, so she doesn't like this Andrew Dice Clay wannabe, but did she listen to George Carlin? Did she listen to Red Fox, Bill Cosby? Did she
I'm
like those
sure
were
she
the
did.
albums like we say Bill Cosby now, but like
No, it was
then
huge.
I knew like my parents when they had their friends over or like family would come over and like, I'd have to go to bed. I would, they would all be downstairs and I would hear them listening to the albums. Like every comedian has like when my parents are around, let me listen to these
Mhm.
albums. And so my thing is like, all right, the nuance of that, like I know that there's a difference between Andrew Dice Clay and Red Fox and George
Mm-hmm.
Carlin
Yeah.
um and Lenny Bruce.
Mhm.
Very
But
much. Huge difference.
what does Murphy Brown think that difference
Mhm.
is?
And I think there's an element to the Murphy Brown character as well that I think plays into this, which is that, she approaches this as, oh, I haven't heard him before, but she's not easily rankled by these
Right?
things. She's also always been one of the guys. So I absolutely believe she listened to George Carlin. Like and nothing has bothered her up to this point. I think there's also something to that idea of, is it having to deal with the fact that this guy isn't treating it as an act when she meets him in person? Like we
Yeah.
have Miles say maybe it's just an act, and then we get the comedy of it. I'm very curious along that point of what is it
Yeah.
that, what about it is that this is the thing, this is the comedian that's too much for her, because she's heard these kinds of jokes
She's
before.
hurt. Like my thing, I get like, let's pretend for a moment Murphy Brown was real and time travel is real. And three of us travel back in time specifically, and we are in that bar with Murphy Brown and those folks. I guarantee you, within like, especially after they've had a few, not even 5 minutes, I will hear, you will hear, and you will hear a joke that is really offensive coming from all of them. Like, oh my God,
Yeah.
like,
Mm-hmm.
have you heard the one? Or knock, knock, like, they're going to try to touch my hair. Like, there will be a joke. Like,
Oh, I would punch Frank. I'm sure I
yeah,
would.
I would hear at some point, like, oh, you're so articulate. Like, there would be a joke that I would hear, and like, I would, context, it's of the time. But what is this rocket guy saying that, like,
Yeah.
I totally get when she wants to strangle him when when he propositions her,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
they were in that room, like, oh
But
my,
she's also been
yeah,
propositioned.
they were in that room, like, oh my God, how can he say that? And I'm like, the comedian in
What is it?
me outside of the journalist is like, I got to hear them jokes now. I got to know.
Mhm.
Well, this might be an interesting time then. I have a quote that I can play for everybody. I was going to use it at the end of my free speech Lenny Bruce thing, but I think it's definitely relevant to this of what George Carlin has to say about Andrew Dice Clay.
Oh,
Go ahead. Yeah,
Well,
go
what I
ahead.
love before you play it is we're talking about, the time and so on, but this clip of George Carlin made the rounds around Chappelle
Yes.
recently. Like, it's a whole generation of people discovered this quote very recently because of current situations.
Yes.
But this was about Andrew Dice Clay.
yeah. Wow, can't wait to hear this.
Many people will bring up Carlin to defend people like Chappelle or a comedian that supposedly gets canceled. And it's like, no, Carlin didn't actually believe what you think he believed. So you don't know
Nope.
Carlin. But what I think is great about this clip is that I also think that it, barring a few things, still very relevant.
I would defend to the death his right to do everything he does. The thing that I find unusual, and it's not a criticism so much, but his targets are underdogs. And comedy traditionally has picked on people in power, people who abuse their power. Women and gays and immigrants are kind of, to my way of thinking, underdogs. And, he ought to be careful because he's Jewish. And a lot of the people who want to pick on these kind of groups, the Jews are on that list. A little further, you got women, gays, blah, 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 and then suddenly you find Jews. And Andrew...
Suddenly Andrew's arrested.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, he should do what he wants, and...
Why does he get away with it, do you think, then?
Well,
we have never laughed at jokes about the
Well,
poor.
he's appealing, I think he's appealing largely. I think his core audience are young white males who are threatened by these groups. I think a lot of these guys aren't sure their manhood, because that's a problem when you're going in through adolescence. You know, am I really? Could I be? I hope I'm not one of them. And the women who assert themselves and are competent are a threat to these men, and so are immigrants in terms of jobs and the
so that's why we as an audience then will laugh.
You say we. I don't think you're.
I mean,
in
no,
but
I
I
mean
think
the
you're
collective we.
I think that's what is at the core of that experience that takes place in these arenas. Is a certain, a sharing of anger and rage at these targets. And I'm sure Andrew isn't that angry at them. I'm sure he's playing it as a comic.
Well said. I mean, yeah. I want to put Richard Pryor in that category as well.
Please do.
Who
Yes.
think they know, and
Yes.
then really it's just like if you ever saw Richard Pryor in an interview, or actually just watch his stand up. But if you know, like, a very sensitive, hurt soul. And
Very
aware.
aware.
I would say the same with Carlin. Like, one of the reasons, like, they are in my, like, you know, if I had a Mount Rushmore, right? Like, is because they were very, very vulnerable and very aware of who they were punching, if they were ever throwing punches at all. 90% of the time, those punches would always land back at themselves. But somebody like Clay, I'm like, his name is Andrew Dice Clay. His stage name is. Don't believe that's his real name.
No.
But his persona was like, I grew up thinking, oh, Andrew Dice Clay is that Italian guy, right? Like, because that was the, you know, if we're thinking of broad stereotypes.
Yeah, or the nursery rhyme guy, right? Like,
right. That was the leather jacket, the hair slicked back. This guy, like, he's got a pinky ring and he's like, that is a very specific, I'm from Jersey, so that's a very specific.
Oh, same.
You are conjuring a very specific guy, very specific role. And to know and like to hear Carlin be like, no, he's a Jewish guy and he should be careful because they are on that list of underdogs. It's like, yeah, no, I think he's aware of that. I think Andrew Dice Clay was very aware of who he really was and who he was talking to. And in relation to Chappelle, who I used to revere, similar to Cosby, like I hate this graveyard of comedians I used to revere, and then I'm like, the thing that to me, I guess where I would differentiate from Carl, I would agree, but I would differentiate of like, I get upset, I get offended when I see like, I know you're smarter than you are, and you're not playing to your intelligence.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's easy jokes, or you're not finishing the thought. You are, like with Chappelle, I see Chappelle purposely putting up a blind spot and I feel like for him, he's just like, he's one of the smartest comics brains out there, but he refuses to remove this like blind spot, keeping him from seeing like the potential harm that trans folks can experience because of his jokes. The potential harm and alienation that his joke can have. He's just like, I got the right to tell the joke. And it's just like, no one's saying you don't, fam. You're smarter than that. Open your spectrum and see like, yeah, follow that thought. I can tell these jokes, but what else? Because you do that with black folks. You do that with the black jokes. Why can't you do it with this category of people? You're not playing to the top of your intelligence. Andrew Dice Clay, I am a fan of the movie Ford Fairlane. And I remember seeing that and being like, and I remember there was a huge resistance of that film because of his toxic personality. And he's a good actor. Yeah. And I'm watching this and I'm like, you're a good actor. You're funny. He doesn't do those jokes, most of those jokes in that movie. You can be likable. What are you doing? You are making a choice to punch down. You are making a choice. And when it becomes clear that it's a choice, for me, that's when you become persona non grata and you go into the comedian graveyard.
Well, and it's also giving me, not to take an even darker sidebar, but the Andrew Tate of it all. The picking the an audience that is going to be aggressively loyal to you because they think they're the ones who are threatened. And this idea of, well, if we just point at everything that's threatening our identity, then we'll be safe over here because everyone's too busy screaming at that. And I have a loyal group of people who think I'm the only one defending them.
Yeah.
I also think,
It can get pretty dangerous.
As a Jew, I appreciated what Carlin brought up, particularly because I think that and this happens in, across all minority groups or all people who, are seen as such, that, I mean, people refer to it as the self-hating Jew, but this idea that oh, you're not going to get me, I'm one of you, right? That happened in Nazi Germany, right? Oh, they're not going to come for me. They're going to come for the other people, right? And then at the end, they do, right? You weren't. You were never any different. And there was actually a New York Times article that I found that referred to the audience at his Madison Square Garden concert as just a sea of white men, with their fists up in the air, and it looked like a Nazi party.
Yeah. And, I would say the same thing to Nikki Haley. Like, to bring it back to her, like, oh,
yeah,
you think you're one of them. First off, we need to define what is one of them. Like, it's typically straight, it's typically white, it's typically male, and Christian, right? Like, that's that's the, like, you don't have an Islamic name, you don't have a Jewish surname, right? Like, you erase those parts of your ethnic or cultural identity to blend into this American idea of what is the straight Christian macho alpha male white male. And if you can't be those, like Nikki Haley, then you fit yourself as close to that proximity of power than you can. And then you focus it, like Ron DeSantis. DeSantis is an Italian last name. There was a moment when Italians were like, for me, I forget who authored the book, but The History of Whiteness. Fascinating book. And it's just like Jewish people weren't considered white. And that's a debate. That's a battle right now you see happening.
That's on TikTok right now.
That's on TikTok.
Yeah, within the Jewish community themselves, right? Like, what is the definition of race?
Right.
And not that, Jews aren't a monolith. No one is a monolith. You can have your own, ideas about everything. And I respect that, right? But it's the nuance of it within the community as well. And
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know where in New Jersey you're from, but my mother is from Millburn. I'm from Scotch Plains.
I'm from Scotch Plains.
Wait, what?
I'm from Scotch Plains, New Jersey. How are you from Scotch Plains, New Jersey?
Wait, what?
07076.
Did we go to high school together and didn't know it?
Shut up.
Wait, did you go to Scotch Plains Family High School?
Yes, I did.
What years?
Oh, this is going to be so embarrassing if we know each other.
It's not embarrassing. It's amazing.
It's so funny because when you said you were from New Jersey, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if we were from... I graduated...
Are you for real?
I graduated in 95.
You graduated in 95? I graduated in 97.
Oh my God! You know my brother!
Who's your brother?
Michael Milberger. He was on a varsity... he was younger than you a little bit, but oh my God.
Are we related? Like, who's your mom?
Who's your mom?
Oh my God, this is so crazy.
I know Michael Milberger. This is wild. Yeah,
Old Spiffy High.
Spiffy High. I did they have the Mr. Spiffy contest when you were still there? Because
I don't remember. I was a big geek. I had no friends.
That probably, yeah.
Same girl.
I grew up in Union County, Scotch Plains.
Yes! This is insane!
This is insane, Lauren.
I've never met
grew up in Scotch Plains.
The only person that I have ever met from Scotch Plains is Mark Shaman.
I know that name.
Well, he wrote with Amber, Some Like It Hot. He did all the music and the lyrics.
Yeah. Holy shit.
Yeah. And when I was 16, I wrote him a fan letter.
Yep.
When I found out he was from Scotch Plains. And he wrote me back. Like, we became pen pals. He's the nicest guy.
Now
like,
I'm going to write Mike
you should
Shaman.
Mark Shaman, yes.
Mark Shaman. And I'm going to be like, yo, there is a Scotch Plains trifecta going on right now.
Seriously.
This is going on the Patreon, y'all. This is too important.
So we meet Murphy's secretary, who seems like the perfect secretary, but actually she's an escapee from an insane asylum, which, we're waiting for that joke to happen.
Here's the deal with the secretaries. The more normal they appear up front, the more insane their problem's going to be. That is the trope of the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot that was we had brought up Seinfeld earlier, but like Kramer was made in the Seinfeld episode, made a cameo.
Yes.
As a Murphy Brown secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, right. And it's a very weird meta joke that, like, if I think about it too hard, it'll start to break my brain,
I will say, we've seen a lot of crazy secretaries. I'm just saying at this point, she seems more than capable. So let's just keep her medicated. She seems great.
That scene is a little terrifying. She's doing that really capable job, and Murphy's like, we're going to have lunch. And then two dudes, I don't care whether they're wearing white outfits.
Yeah.
They're just like, yeah, we got to drag this lady back. I don't buy that brother's being like, yeah, she was in a plane cockpit. No. No, there was an application process. There were references that were searched. That office just can't let this woman be hauled
But wait a
off.
second. You've seen Secret of My Success, right? Where he just goes in an empty office, which is based on like some executive who was or Spielberg, I think, right? Who like goes in and was like, I work here now. It wasn't necessarily in the cockpit. I think it was in the tower, right? So maybe somehow she just got herself into the tower. That kind of believable.
Here's the deal. If Christina Applegate can become a fashion designer after the babysitter dies,
there
anyone
you go.
can do anything.
We start our meeting with Murphy, and she wants to interview this guy named Tony Rocket, who we've been alluding to, the king of shock. And Corky is actually for it. Everyone is against it because she trusts Murphy. But of course, we find out that Murphy actually has not listened to the cassette. I believe the title of the album is called On All Fours, just to give everyone.
Sure is.
And I thought it was interesting that Frank brings up the fact that we have, NEA grant issues, flag burning. Because when I was reading a little bit on Andrew Dice Clay, something that surprised me was that there were these letters to the New York Times that was talking about, mostly from conservatives who were saying, well, if liberals are so upset about Andrew Dice Clay, maybe he should just say he's a performance artist like Karen Finley. Like really so much like whataboutism like today of like, oh, well, if this is what you really think. It just felt so, it's the same song again.
Yeah.
Just different lyrics.
Different lyrics, yeah. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Jim brings up censorship. We get a whole sort of, special episode about what censorship can do, the First Amendment, why we're here today. Miles isn't sold, but Murphy's going to start her research. Frank tells her not to listen to it on an empty stomach. And this is when Murphy says, well, that she's a big girl and it takes a lot to shock her.
So she thinks.
So super quick, I am just going to talk about the history, which is not really like the full history of like how we got here with stand-up, just because I've done a lot of research on Lenny Bruce. But what I think is really interesting is that even Carlin, who looked up to Lenny Bruce, says that when he was younger, he was like, oh man, we're getting arrested together. This is great. And Lenny was like, no, that's not the goal, right? Like, I'm not here to shock. I'm not here to get arrested. I just want to do comedy. I just want to tell the truth.
Right.
And this is just getting in the way. The goal is not to get arrested because then I can't work. Because that's eventually what happened to him, is that he got arrested so much. Anything from, talking about the lewd sexual acts of the Pope, talking about race, to saying the word schmuck, which like today would be considered, most people think it means stupid, right? Like it's not even on anyone's radar. But what I found out, which was interesting, was that in 1957, there was a landmark case in the Supreme Court, which is around the time when you start to get what we know as modern stand-up, like late 50s into the 60s. It was Roth versus United States, saying that anything obscene was not constitutionally protected speech because it wasn't a redeeming social importance. And that the people of the sort of, areas in which these people were being obscene, they were the ones who were going to say what was considered obscene. So like Lenny Bruce gets arrested in Chicago because Chicago's cops are mostly Irish Catholic and he's making fun of the Pope. Cardinal Spellman in the 60s who pretty much did this with movies and anything, is one of the reasons why Lenny Bruce was arrested at the Cafe A Go-Go in the mid-60s, which then eventually, he was arrested then with the owner of the Cafe A Go-Go. So here you have the owner is arrested. So Lenny Bruce gets blacklisted. So no one can perform in a certain way, whether it's saying dirty words or just talking about sort of, dirty, or as they called them, sick comedians. Which is interesting because the other side of that, which really surprised me, was they were like, oh, well, these are well comedians. But also what was interesting was that even though Lenny Bruce, Mart Saul, Lenny Berman are going to be sort of the poster child of the First Amendment, and Lenny's really the only one who's really getting sort of mostly arrested, they're still using the word sick for people like Bob Newhart. Because he's mocking historical figures or political figures, which like today is like Bob Newhart, Nichols and May, which you don't think of being like offensive in the sense of like someone like a Lenny Bruce. Yeah. You also have a cabaret license in New York that if you don't have your cabaret license, you can't perform. And of course, that started because of jazz in the 20s, and it really was just another form of racism.
Well, we can just pick and choose who gets a license.
Exactly.
We could talk for hours about the fact that like Lenny Bruce got to be in the position of being arrested to begin with, which is his own level of privilege. Like, there are plenty of people who wouldn't even made it to the point of being arrested.
Because he's able to perform in white spaces, right? Like, you have, Dick Gregory, and you have, we talked about Red Fox, right? But, like, they're not allowed to be in a lot of the spaces that Lenny Bruce is allowed to be in. So even though they're probably saying similar things, and, I mean, Red Fox's comedy albums were really what, got him more attention, but that was something that was sold, like, even in Mrs. Maisel, right? She buys a Red Fox album in the basement. She can't buy it upstairs.
Right.
So it's
literally underground.
People forget, like, I think people like Red Fox was a young guy at some point.
Yeah.
Like when Sanford and Son aired, he was, even though they made him look older, but he was in his 50s.
Oh
like,
man, I always forget that.
He had a career. And he was like just one of the more well-known, like there, you can like the history of black comedy is fascinating in itself with Dick Gregory, but you have Moms Mabley and who's an out queer woman, but like telling but like I saw the one-man show with Joe Morton who played Dick Gregory.
Oh wow.
It was brilliant. But like him finally getting a stand-up spot at the Playboy Mansion.
Yes, yeah.
Was a big deal.
Yeah.
The Dick Gregory that stand-up to the Dick Gregory we knew in his later years, who's the, would fast and, was an activist. Two different people. A lot of black stand-ups then, like you wore a suit, you wore a tie. Carlin was in that tradition, even though Carlin was Irish Catholic, like suit, tie. And then there was a really intentional break of like, yo, we can't do this anymore. I know the 60s is always brought up as such a period, but it was really, I don't think people really have a context of just how strict
it really was,
and conservative America was.
And it's really all stems from this court case.
Right.
Because of what was happening in the culture.
Well, and it's all holding on to this desperate, the emphasis on desperate attempt to hold on to a status quo that had been sold to them. It wasn't even the reality of life that they were trying to hold on. It was from this concept and this marketing of the 1950s that they had been told was ideal life. That wasn't actually even true for the majority of the population.
And that's what Lenny Bruce wanted to do, right? He wanted to be like, this is really what we're all talking about, right? Like, this is really what's happening in the world. They're just not letting you hear it. And the sad part about him, at least a lot of people were talking about were able to have a career later on or had a career, younger people than the people we're talking about because of people like Dick Gregory and Lenny Bruce. But Lenny Bruce dies in 66. And then in 67, New York gets rid of the whole cabaret license.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then things just sort of, propel from there. And then by 1971, you have Cohen versus California, which is about a man who wore fuck the draft shirt to court and got arrested, and they brought that up, and that's where you get the idea, or the phrase, I should say, of one man's. I'm going to mess it up. One man's obsceneness is another man's lyric. That's not the the quote, but like, it's all in the eye of the beholder. But that court case in 71 was about the idea, well, we can't censor. That's what the First Amendment is about, because you can get to the point, which when we talk about DeSantis today, is that then you could possibly censor things that you don't believe in just because you don't believe in it, because it's all based on the perception of you in that moment and not of the law.
Right. Which brings to me, which is why this Murphy episode is so interesting. Like, all those characters lived through everything you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They lived through that. They had those albums. So what? Again, why all of a sudden like this blindness to who you actually are when confronted with this character? Murphy, you're a journalist. Dismantle this guy like you would anyone else.
Like, Murphy, you've talked to war criminals.
Right.
I mean, could we say that like
murderers?
Her ego gets in the way in the sense that like she's just so upset that she has to do the interview that she just puts on blinders, which is why she explodes.
And this is also something that I've referenced in the past with third wave feminism. Like, she is also a white woman who has the convenience of not having everything directly affect her. And this directly
she's not used to that,
affects her.
Right?
Like, this is something where she's the one being attacked. And it's easier to be a journalist and be objective when you can look at all the sides and they aren't specifically about your body and your person. This is someone who is making, she says, the female gender like a kicking post. Totally. She is the one who is, it's personal now in a way that not everything always is that she covers, because she is someone who has played the boys club and has risen to a point where she gets to cover everything. And it's not always about her.
No, it's not. And I think it's a great point. I think she's also, I want to say, there's got to be a better word than victim. But they all are. They are kind of subjects of. So the 80s to me is an interesting, like, the 80s is the period of my, like, consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's my childhood. It's, like, what I, like, when I started, like, seeing things. And the 90s was, like, my teen years into my young adulthood. But the 80s, when I remember there were, and I'm going to try, I don't want to keep burning time, but, like, I remember there was, like, a real fascination with the 50s in the 80s.
Yeah.
Like, every, like, mayonnaise commercial, every mayonnaise commercial was, like, a doo-wop, like, Dijonais! Like, it was all, like, everyone
the raisins, yeah.
Doo-wop, like, right, like...
Oh, the raisins.
The raisins. It was a real love for, like, the 50s and early 60s and kind of that polished, sold idea. And I remember when the 90s came along and, like, you had the riots in LA and OJ, then, like, and JFK with Oliver Stone, and then there was like let's really talk about the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like this period, watching that newsroom on Murphy Brown, watching FYI and seeing, like, there's nary a brown face there.
Mm-hmm.
That the 80s was, that's when Reagan was in power. And Bush, and 80s was locking down, I feel like, locking down a lot of people who went through the 50s and 60s and trying to, like, nope, now we're adults.
Yeah, yuppies, and right? Like all the hippies were now yuppies.
All the hippies are now yuppies, and we're kind of shunning whatever revolutionary or radical experiences they had in their youth. And I feel like, the 60s was tumultuous. 50s was conservative. 60s was a lot of, just upheaval. And the 70s was everybody getting high and partying and discoing to try to live through the trauma of the 60s. Mm-hmm. And then the 80s was like, okay, but now we got to pay bills, and I actually like making money and want property. To me, like, when I looked at the trajectory from, like, post-World War II to today, everything kind of makes sense in that regard, and, like, why we're repeating what we are repeating today, and why someone like Trump or DeSantis can rise to power is because, using Murphy Brown as an example, she is like a victim of that amnesia. Mm-hmm. And so when you get a character who's anachronistic like this Andrew Dice Clay character, who is very conservative but is also radical at the same time, he doesn't make sense.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. He doesn't fit into a box for her, so she's confused.
yeah, you don't make sense for me. If you're telling those jokes and you're my boss, oh, that's a good one. But if you're telling those jokes and then you're grabbing your crotch and like, oh wait, what? You don't fit in this time period. And I think that's another reason why Andrew Dice Clay, who again I'm not a fan of, but why he rankled so many white people is because like you're not. Don't you see what we're all doing right now? Like we all put the suits back on and and like you're with the fringes, you're with the Nazis. Like we don't openly acknowledge those guys. Well, now we do because we ignored them and like they were kept on the fringes of our amnesia. And then when Barack Obama became president, people lost their minds and the floodgates opened. Murphy Brown, she like didn't she have an episode where she was smoking weed?
Yeah, but she had cancer.
All right, yeah. So it
But also, yeah, let's remember that she, Murphy Brown got arrested at the Democratic National Convention. Like she was one of the young change makers, but now is one of the old guard. She's becoming the old guard.
Like when there's a flashback to like when she first gets the job and she's dressed like Annie Hall and she's got big, huge curly hair like Diane Cannon. And, she's just like all over the place. And they're like, oh, we don't know if we should hire this woman with the crazy hair. But I also think that part of Murphy, and not in this particular episode, is someone who kind of looks around and goes, wait, weren't we radicals? Like, hey, I'm still here. Like, and that all of her sort of cohorts have moved on to become sort of adults. And, you know, she still wants to be a radical. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We had so much fun talking with Tarik that this is going to be another part 2 episode.
As you could tell, it's 3 people who love to chat with each other. So we wanted to make sure that we don't take out too much of that great chatter. So we think that this is a really exciting opportunity to hear a little bit more, to go a little bit more in depth into what we're talking about.
In fact, you're not even going to have to wait 2 weeks. We're going to post this on Thursday. So please definitely tune in. Tarik had some wonderful things to say, and we don't want you to miss any of it.
No, we're really looking forward to hearing the rest of this.
I also wanted to add a little bit for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Andrew Dice Clay to kind of, bring you into the next part. But I didn't get a chance to read from this New York Times review that I think is very telling, is that in it says that Andrew Dice Clay refers to himself as the most vulgar, vicious comic ever to walk the face of the earth.
I don't know. I just feel like he's compensating for something, but that's fine.
Yes. Now, I'm not saying that that's true, but I think it's important to highlight that that's what he thinks of himself.
I think if you have to say that about yourself, perhaps you're not meeting your goals.
Perhaps. So we will see.
But we'll talk more about that.
Yes, we will for part 2. And also remember that you can follow along with us and watch this episode on the Internet Archive. The link is on our website. And be sure to follow us on social media at Murphy Brown Pod.
We'll see you next time
for another edition of FYI,
the Murphy Brown Podcast.